Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the second episode in the Understanding Politics series. Today, we are going to be talking about government entropy. Now, there is no system of government conceivable that is stable forever. Eventually, any system will decay, which is the entropy of the government. Now, there is two types of stability here that you need to differentiate. The first type is continuity stability. You see this most readily in Tier 1 governments, which I discussed in the last video, which are generally speaking warlord governments. In a continuity stability, the next leader of a country, the next government of a country, carries the same process as the last. So, in a modern, stable democracy, continuity stability means when one party loses the election, the next party forms government and power transfers smoothly, and the government's current functions continue smoothly until otherwise legislated. By contrast, in a warlord government, typically when the warlord dies, there is a period of strife and possibly civil war before a new warlord emerges, and that warlord has no obligation and no need to continue on the things the previous warlord did. So in that sense, a warlord government has very low continuity stability, but a liberal democracy has a very high continuity stability. The other type of stability is tier persistency stability. Pardon me, 1 second. Now, tier persistency stability represents how likely a government is going to stay the way it is over long periods of time. In other words, will it change frequently? So a tier change would be going from a warlord system to a warlord monarchy or a divine monarchy, or going up the tiers of government or down the tiers of government that I outlined in the last video. That would be a change in your tier stability. It's the second type of stability that you can discuss in a government. So basically, is the structure, this form of government the same? So in general here, the stability of a system is basically how long that system will continue as is. Both types. There's two aspects of it, but the overall stability of a system is how long the current system, both in form and function, will persist. Different types of systems have different levels of engagement with this. Autocratic governments tend to be extremely stable and continuity stability up until the autocrat dies, and then there is a potential for lots of continuity stability to happen there, instability to happen there, I should say. Whereas a democratic system more frequently risks continuity stability with elections, but because of the regular transfer of power and the abstraction of power from the executive person to bureaucracy, the more continuity stability you have, because the new executive of the country, the new chief executive, is unlikely to be able to do much unilaterally and quickly. Most of the time, they have to go through this slow legislative process, which preserves stability by consulting legislation as opposed to executive decree. Now, overall, regardless of anything, the base state of any society is a tier 1 warlord government. You see this whenever there is a chaotic civil war, in gang warfares, drug cartels, whatever. Whenever society breaks down from a higher level of government, it always immediately goes to a tier 1 government of warlords, unless your revolution or your coup manages to succeed immediately. If the central government falls apart, though, you will almost always descend immediately to warlords. And this is pretty much how it's always going to be, because warlord systems are extremely tier persistent. A warlord system has an immense amount of stability at staying where it is, and as a result, government systems can easily default to that. It can easily collapse into that because it's a very, very stable system from tier persistency. A warlord state or warlord period can last centuries or decades. Depends. You look at places like Somalia today, or Libya today, or the peripheries of Mexico where the drug cartels effectively control the country. They don't literally control the country, but they effectively control much of the outskirts of Mexico, where the federal government is weak. Or you look historically at the warlord period in China, or the Sengoku Jedi in Japan, or basically the feudal period in Europe. It's very similar. Warlord period is very tier persistent. It stays that way for a very long time because it's very difficult for any particular warlord to garner enough power to advance to a warlord monarchy. It can happen, and it does happen, and it always will happen, but it takes a long time, and it can stay that way for a very long time. In fact, it could, in principle, stay that way forever if you never get the right combination of warlord. So, in this sense, any level of government past tier 1 is only a meta-tier stable government. It can be stable in the sense that if you picture picture like a cliff, and you have you have a mountain, and you have a small little valley, and then you have a further drop of a mountain. The bottom of the mountain is your warlord system. The little valley on the top of the mountain is your meta-stable position that a more advanced government can rest in. In that position, it can stay there for an arbitrarily long amount of time, assuming government is healthy and good. But with enough crises, enough bad decisions, you get enough impetus that this will spontaneously collapse either down to warlords or to transform into a different tier of government. It could go up a step, it could go down a step. And I just want to really emphasize here that tiers of government I talked about in the last video are not necessarily saying that this is better or worse, but this is how the progression of governments seems to go based on history. That is not a statement of good. It is a statement of, it's a descriptive statement, not a prescriptive statement. An example of such a situation where a government that is a more advanced tier just spontaneously collapsed would be the divine monarchy of the Ancien regime in France in 1789. The sovereign debt crisis precipitated basically the French Revolution. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that was the specific cause. And the French Revolution didn't devolve to warlords. It actually kicked it up a tier, but that is one of the things. When a metastable system collapses, it could fall down the cliff, fall down the mountain to the bottom. That happened in China when the Qing dynasty was kicked out. Or it could go up the mountain because you could have enough energy and enough momentum to go up to the next level of metastable position, which would be going up a tier. Generally speaking, the ideas of the more advanced forms of government is to try to create a system that is even more metastable than the previous ones. Well, more stable in the general sense, but metastable in de facto regards, if that makes sense. Of these, continuity stability is relatively easy to achieve. Pretty much any codified, clear set of rules will achieve it. Monarchies, you have clear succession laws. Democracies, you have clear electoral laws and power transfer protocols. As long as you have these, you should be able to maintain continuity stability, except in niche scenarios such as the extinction of a royal line or a large segment of the population losing faith in elections. You might lose faith for various reasons, illegitimate or legitimate, but the loss of faith is the problem, not any other reason in particular. Maybe there's fraud happening. Maybe they believe fraud has happened. Maybe they believe elections don't do anything. It doesn't matter. What matters is the loss of faith in the system. Now, tier stability is much more difficult. Because the fundamental instability in tier stability isn't the faith of the citizens, isn't rules, isn't protocols. It's that there are people who will try to change the system. In the case of France, these are your Rousseaus, these are your Sieyès, these are your Robespierres. They want to change the system. Generally speaking, most people want to change the system because they think what their idea is better than what the current system is. I will not categorically say there's never been someone who wanted to change it for something that'd be worse, but in general terms, people want to change the system to make it better, even if you are talking about a Caesar type. The Caesar type believes that their leadership is going to be better than whatever replaces it, or whatever they've replaced. You have this fun statement, I would say, that you see a lot in political discussion, among politicians, among pundits, where everyone thinks that the dictatorship would work if only they were the dictator. The most humble of people will acknowledge that they probably won't be the best dictator, and in fact, the system might not work if they were the dictator. But, generally speaking, when you're talking about the excise of political power, most people think that they would be able to do it better. Especially when you're talking about politicians, because politicians typically have crippling pride problems. So, in this regard, tier stability is similar to continuity stability in democracies, where the faith in elections is needed to maintain continuity stability. Belief in the system is required to maintain tier stability. The citizens of the country need to believe that this system of government is the best one they can get. The only real way for a system of government, or a government, to try to protect the system as is to educate the population on how the system works and why we have the system. In other words, civics education. The lack of civics education can lead to people not understanding the system, not understanding the rationale for the system, not understanding the problems being solved by the system, and that opens these people up to radicals to change their mind about the legitimacy of the system. And once they start questioning the legitimacy of the system, you open the door for radical change, tier change. So, in general, no system will fall for no reason. If times are good, if there's abundance, if pardon me. If times are good, there's abundance, people are making lots of money, people are having kids, people are buying houses, all the things you might want. You have all the widgets in the world. There's never going to be instability. There will not be a situation where you're going to have, for lack of better terms, a revolution or a coup or a civil war if the people inhabiting a country are doing well. They don't have to necessarily be doing well in absolute terms. They just have to be doing well compared to what they have done previously. We see this in modern China, at least prior to COVID, where objectively the People's Republic of China is a very oppressive, very totalitarian government, but the people in China are living much higher quality lives than they did 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 80 years ago. So the citizens in China have very little reason to want to do something, at least pre-COVID, because their lives were getting better than they were in the past. Things were going upwards. In general, bad decisions, crises may happen during these times, but as long as the trajectory is going up, people will generally be content to stay as is. However, accumulation of these bad decisions, and more importantly, accumulation of crises, and how the government reacts to the crisis, causes the kernel of instability. Regardless of whether it's continuity or tier, though typically it's tier stability. Continuity stability is rarely a problem in advanced systems. In fact, normally when people use the term stability of government, they mean tier stability, because continuity stability is almost taken for granted. So it's this inaction or bad actions, the discontent caused by bad governance and bad reactions to crises that build up over time that create the loss of faith in the system as a whole that allows a crisis in the future to devolve into a collapse. Now, to give a more detailed example, we're going to go back to Ancient Regime France. So France had hundreds of years of continuity stability by 1789. And tier stability, you could argue, since about Louis XIII. I would say prior to Louis XIII, France was probably more of a warlord monarchy, but Louis XIII onward, they're more of a divine monarchy. So, by 1789, you're at nearly 200 years of the divine monarchy, of the Ancien regime, and the Bourbons, or Capets, Bourbons being a cadet branch of the Capets, had been governing France, for the most part, uncontested since at least 1453, when the 100 Years' War officially ended, though arguably during the 100 Years' War they had become uncontested rulers of France. And the continuity of government was pretty much proclaimed at that point, or guaranteed. So we're talking about nearly 500 years, let's say, of continuity stability here. 300 years. Does that math work out? Yes. Yeah, 300 years-ish. 350 years. So, quite stable, has existed for quite a long time. In the 1780s, France was suffering a major sovereign debt crisis. This was caused by all the wars fought by Louis XIV and Louis XV, like we're talking War of the Spanish Succession, War of the Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War. There's probably other wars I'm missing, but those are the three big ones in the 1700s. This racked up an immense amount of debt, particularly the 7 Years' War racked up a lot of debt. And France is effectively insolvent. Because of the circumstances in France, being the preeminent land power in Europe, and this is 1789, well, 1780s technically at this point, well, 1770s, 1780s, they aren't actually really in a position that they could reduce spending, because almost all their spending is on the military, either be it the Navy or the Army. There is some spending on maintaining court, on paying bureaucrats, paying officials, but that's small change. And in general terms, you can't really reduce that spending either. You can't just stop having the parlements run, which are effectively the courts in France at the time. It's a bit more complicated than that, but we're going to oversimplify for a second. You can't reduce spending on the military, because if they do, then Austria or Britain might take advantage of them. Okay. So they basically can't reduce spending. So they have this sovereign debt crisis. They have a huge string of effectively finance ministers. They're not actually called finance ministers, but they're effectively finance ministers going through trying to solve the problem, largely to no avail. And this is made worse in about 1778, 79. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head here. One of those 2 years, this is made infinitely worse because France decided to support the American Revolution. They're not just supporting the American Revolution on paper. They're not just acknowledging it. They're committing troops. They're sending arms. They're sending money. They're sending their navy. They're effectively fighting an entire new war on behalf of the American rebels. This took the probably solvable, albeit uncomfortable crisis, and made it to an unsolvable crisis. At least through normal means. Because the thing you need to understand is the monarch of France, Louis XVI here, has no power to raise taxes. He could ask the parlements to raise taxes, but they will not consent to permanent tax increases. And they need a permanent tax increase. So in an effort to stave this off, they try to debase the currency, which just takes the sovereign debt crisis from being one for Louis XVI's problem to being a problem to the peasant in France. Notably, the urban poor of Paris really suffered from this because the peasants grew their own food, so they didn't suffer as much about food prices going up because they made the food. But the urban poor in Paris particularly really suffered from this. This ended up forcing Louis XVI to call the Estates General, which is effectively Parliament. Not quite, but effectively. And this is where everything went downhill. The Third Estate and the Estates General, in general terms, this effectively just was the middle class, but technically it was everybody who wasn't the nobility or the church, but effectively it was the middle class, decided to basically take over France. It didn't happen overnight. It took from basically summer 1789 to fall 1792, but in those 3 years they kept encroaching on more power from the king until they had effectively removed the king, and then they did literally remove the king in 1792, and the French Revolution proper started. Now, comment below if you want a more detailed, more in-depth discussion on the French Revolution. I could easily do that, but this is enough for the point of analysis here. So, the French Revolution here wasn't just a problem of the people of France being unhappy. They were unhappy. I skipped over the discontent among the intellectuals, the middle class, the people from the system of government for brevity. But the important thing here is that there was a whole system of issues that grew up to this, but the specific issue at the end was the spiraling of the sovereign debt crisis and the pressure caused by the debasement on the regular people. It wasn't one decision. Even among this 30 years of problems that led up to 1789, it wasn't one decision. It wasn't the 7 Years' War. It wasn't the cycling of finance ministers, which reduced confidence in the kingdom, effectively. It wasn't backing the American Revolution. It wasn't the debasement. It wasn't all of the shenanigans that happened once the Estates General happened. It was all of them. It's things like this which cause a tier change. Now, in the case of Ancien Regime France, we didn't see it decay to a warlord state, but it did go from a divine monarchy to a post-Rousseauian republic, the first and most prominent example of such a government. At the end of the day, the post-Rousseauian Republic of France only lasted 3 years. That's a bit generous, too. I think it's closer to 2, until Robespierre's head is removed, and then we have the Directorate, which is kind of a... I don't even know how to really classify the Directorate. And then you get Napoleon effectively as dictator and then monarch, so... It was a very unstable time period once he removed the Ancien regime. But the general note here, and the important thing to see here, is that no system of government, no matter the tier, can exist forever. One crisis won't take you out. 2 crises won't take you out. Some bad decisions won't take you out. The problem is it's the accumulation of these crises and these decisions. And the problem isn't that they happen in short order, it's that they happen at all. Because at the time, one crisis, again, the sovereign debt crisis, the sovereign debt crisis itself wasn't the problem. It was the reaction to the reaction to the reaction to the reaction to the reaction of it. And all the other social problems that I've oversimplified and ignored. It wasn't one of these decisions. It was the building of these decisions. And most importantly, it's that the people in the current moment can look back at this trend and this sequence of bad decisions. You could have problems that go back 50 years, 100 years, and people can look at that and they can see that, and it can cause further instability. An example of this would be the American Civil War. The specific cause that caused the Civil War was Abraham Lincoln being elected. But Abraham Lincoln being elected in and of itself didn't cause the Civil War. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. But it wasn't the general cause. It was the specific trigger. If the last 71 years of American history hadn't happened, Lincoln would not have basically instigated a civil war by being alive in office. It was the 71 years prior, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the expansion of slavery-ish in the South, oversimplifying a bit, Dred Scott decision, the Nason-Dixon line, etc., etc. All of these things built up, Bloody Kansas, etc. All of these things built up, created distrust, decades and decades of bad government, bad decisions, poor decisions relying to a crisis, had built up, and by Abraham Lincoln's election, a critical mass of people in places like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, etc., had no faith in the federal government of the U.S., and they seceded. That is the trajectory of government crisis. That caused a tier change, that caused conflict. That is the trend of it. That is what happens. It's not one decision. It's not even a bunch of decisions close together. It is a history of decisions that marginalize or alienate some segment of the population. How that population is alienated and how that population is dispossessed changes the character of what's going to happen. But it will always prompt something bigger. Eventually, all of this debt of bad governance will create a crisis of faith in the system, and that will lead to either revolution, a civil war, or a coup. Which one that is depends on what happened and the specifics of what is happening. But that is the end result, if nothing changes. And generally speaking, because most politicians are very selfish or very self-important, they don't see the issues that they are causing for the future. And that is why there is no system of government that is stable forever. They will always hit one of these crises. But those crises are the topic for next video, which I will be releasing probably in February. Though we will see. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up here, and I will bid you all adieu. And hopefully I will see you next week with something, but it depends on polls, because the 2 videos I planned on releasing for sure this month are done at this point, but hopefully we'll have polls and stuff by the next 2 weeks in January to get stuff. But for now, I bid you adieu. If you liked the video, like, share, subscribe. Comment below what you thought. If you disagree, if you agree, if you have any feedback. Love reading all the comments, even if you think I'm being dumb. Love the comments. And to that, once again, bid you adieu. How many times is that now? 3? And I'll see you, hopefully, next week.